Hi, I'm Thanks Too Much, and welcome to the final video into our look into the Dead Space series. Today we're going to take a look at Dead Space 3. Want to take a look at the few things it did right and everything it did wrong, which is a lot. But the few things it did right were actually kind of fun, so let's take a closer look. Dead Space 3 is a complicated game for me to talk about. On the one hand, it's a game that completely misses the mark on the many things that made the series such a unique survival horror experience. On the other hand, if you can look past the fact that this is supposed to be a Dead Space game and see this game for what it truly is, which is an enjoyable but glorified paint-by-numbers action game with the Dead Space name slapped on top, then you can still have some fun with Dead Space 3. Admittedly, it is enjoyable if you view it from that angle. However, that in and of itself is a huge problem, and the main reason why so many people either dislike Dead Space 3 or have forgotten about it entirely. While this franchise has always had some elements of action, it was never so much that it overwhelmed the horror. In the previous two games, you were always on your feet, always on the lookout, and always paying attention because your resources were just as much a source of tension as your enemies. That's more or less gone with Dead Space 3. Now, have all the futuristic guns you want, and our favorite hero Isaac Clarke has gone from space engineer to space marine faster than this game killed its own franchise. Many people have come before me and said that Dead Space 3 is a betrayal of the Dead Space formula and the reason why the series has gone dark ever since. I agree, but what I want to know is exactly what happened. What happened to the game, what happened to Visceral, and what happened to the overlords at EA who thought they were smart enough to take hold of a franchise they clearly knew nothing about. But first, I want to address the so-called story in Dead Space 3, just to get it off my chest. Now, I apologize in advance. I usually like to take a step back and truly analyze a game's story, even if it's crap. But there's no way around how bad the story in Dead Space 3 is. Kids in preschool are better at making turkey drawings with their hands than the writers of Dead Space 3 are at making a story. You start by seeing a struggling and heartbroken Isaac Clarke. Apparently, Ellie and Isaac had a relationship somewhere between Dead Space 2 and 3, but Ellie's now gone because, I don't know, reasons. You only get a text log explaining that Ellie had become frustrated with Isaac's refusal to face his past, so she left him. That small detail right there has more emotion than the entirety of Dead Space 3. But in this game, we don't have time for likable characters, and we don't have time for a story that's trying to say something. Now, to be fair, the previous games were not loved because of their stories, but at least the narrative in both games had something to say of real-life extremism if you cared enough to look under the surface. Here, there is barely anything under the surface, and to make things worse, almost everything is as hollow as a ping pong ball. I recall saying in my in-depth look at Dead Space 2 that I wish the story focused more on the unitology aspect rather than on the EarthGov aspect. Well, in Dead Space 3, I got my wish, and now I regret ever wanting a Dead Space story to solely focus on unitology. To make a long story short, unitology and its fanatics, led by a guy called Jacob Danik, were somehow able to completely destroy EarthGov, save for a few characters that lead Isaac on his new journey. If the writers of Dead Space 3 gave a single solitary shit about the story, then this perspective of unitology could have been an opportunity to continue showing the dangers of extreme and blind belief based on things such as religion. Instead, Danik serves as your main antagonist, and he is as cardboard cutout bad guy as they come. He has a British accent, because apparently all bad guys need British accents, and he only speaks to threaten Isaac and say evil things in case it wasn't obvious enough to the player that he's the bad guy. He spouts a lot of convoluted and cryptic bullshit that makes the story hard to follow. Oh, and he looks like Elton John for some reason. Danik never shuts up about being the man who will lead humanity into a new age of unitology, but when he goes into these incoherent rants, he sounds more like a paint-by-numbers madman rather than a religious leader with a god complex. Danik's only saving grace is that if you can see through the lines upon lines of horrible dialogue, Danik's behavior and mannerisms do come from a guy who is completely consumed by blind and unquestionable faith, and had he had been written better, he could have been a decent antagonist who is doing what he does because he genuinely believes in unitology. It's true that actions speak louder than words, but words have power too. And Danek's persistence in unlocking the forbidden secrets of unitology could have allowed for an entertaining story bits if more effort was put into the writing. Instead, we have evil for evil's sake, with unitology used as a way to move the story forward, and this, like so many things in this game, is very disappointing to me because it takes the brain out of a game series that tried to make you think. In Dead Space 3, you can search for deeper meaning, but all you'll find is scraps of good ideas mixed with a whole mountain of wasted opportunities. Unfortunately, most of the new characters that make up your team don't fare much better in the characterization department. When Isaac is forced into his new journey, he is called on by Robert Norton and John Carver. Norton comes off as a huge bro trying his best to act like a hardened soldier, and Carver is a hardened soldier, but he is also an insufferable jackass. Norton is really only in the game to complain about stuff because he's Ellie's new boyfriend, because apparently we needed a love triangle in a Dead Space game. I can't think of a single moment in the game in which Norton does something, anything, besides complain or get into a dick measuring contest with Isaac over Ellie. I don't understand why EA thought this kind of story was necessary unless, of course, they knew nothing about what made a Dead Space story unique, but mercifully, Norton isn't around most of the time, so you can just ignore him. The person you can't ignore is Carver. Carver is your second player, because one of the big selling points of Dead Space 3 was that you can play the entire thing cooperatively with Carver. Resident Evil 5 was released about 4 years before Dead Space 3, and at that time it was the highest selling Resident Evil game on the market, and a big selling point of that game was that you could play the whole thing cooperatively. From a business standpoint, you can see how copying Resident Evil 5 might lead EA to think that it would have helped Dead Space 3 reach a wider audience. It's important to note that Visceral Games had less control over Dead Space 3, and EA was giving more control that, in hindsight, they obviously shouldn't have. I'll get to that aspect soon. But my point here is if you're going to make what used to be a survival horror game into a co-op experience, at least make sure your second player is likable. I can only speak for myself, but when I play games, it is very important for me to enjoy playing as the person, animal, or thing that I'm controlling. Playing as Carver just sucks. There's no other way to put it, it sucks. The game tries too hard to make you sympathize with him by adding the story we all heard a million times of his wife and kid being killed at the hands of the main antagonist Danek. There are a few good ideas with Carver's character, mainly the fact that if you play as him, he will have hallucinations about toy soldiers and birthday parties as a manifestation of his guilt for not being there when his family needed him. It could have been heartbreaking stuff, but Carver isn't Luigi, he isn't the Arbiter, hell, he isn't even Navi. Carver is literally just a cliche of hardened soldier character traits that people who think they know about character development put on to make someone seem distant and cold, but they actually come off as insufferable and moronic. Think of it this way.
Carver, the hardened soldier, lost his wife and son at the hands of Danek. Now he must team up with Isaac Clarke to bring him down. But Carver doesn't like Isaac because he's a pussy space engineer. But they must work together so Carver can have his revenge.
Almost like classic 80s bullshit, to be honest. Some will point out that you can play the whole game just as Isaac, which is true. But the shadow of the game always shoving Carver down your throat is always present, especially in parts of the game that are locked because you can only access them via co-op. Which is a problem because no one wants to play as Carver. Carver's only saving grace is that towards the end, he does have one, maybe two heartfelt conversations with Isaac as to whether he was focused too much on his own bravado that it cost him the lives of the people around him. More moments like this were needed throughout the game, but towards the end, it's too little too late. Dead Space 3 also nerfed the hell out of Ellie, which is a damn shame. In Dead Space 2, Ellie was a no-nonsense woman who took care of herself and even saved Isaac during the finale. Here, she is still somewhat of a leader, as she is the one who leads everyone into this new adventure to destroy the marker, but her main reason for returning is to create tension between Norton and Isaac, which is completely pointless because the players don't give a damn about Norton since he is so bland to begin with. Instead of creating an irritable character like Carver, it would have been a million times more enjoyable to have made Ellie the second player character and base some of the story around the relationship between her and Isaac. We know Ellie, and we definitely know Isaac, so you already have half of your work done since these are the characters we would have cared about. Seeing the relationship between Ellie and Isaac develop in real time, rather than just giving us a snippet between what happened during Dead Space 2 and 3, would have made people more invested in the story, even if all the other characters in the game remained as bland as they are. And on that note, the only character that the player really cares about is Isaac himself. Isaac is still the only one who feels somewhat human. Leaving aside the moments in which the game makes Isaac survive situations where he clearly should die, Isaac is pretty much a normal guy. He's gone through heartbreak. What he's experienced in the past 2 games is still haunting him, and there are moments where you do feel for the guy, even if the dialogue written to express these feelings kinda sucks. Isaac has the benefit of being with us in the last 2 games, so the player is more open to hear Isaac out, and therefore we still want to play as Isaac. He does have some cringe-worthy moments here and there, and he definitely comes off as whiny in some areas, but he is still the glue that holds these crappy characters together, even if you need concrete to have any of it stick. Now, I can bitch and complain about the story and characters all day, but I don't want to make it seem that I completely hated this game. Yes, the story and characters suck, but what about the actual gameplay? Well, here is where we enter into a paradox. On the one hand, the gameplay is pretty much action. There's barely any survival horror elements left in Dead Space 3, with only a few sprinkles here and there. On the other hand, it's still fun. If, and this is a big if, but if you can forget that this is supposed to be a Dead Space game and enjoy it as an action game, then you're in for a fun time. Nothing special, but still fun. Gone are the engineering tools that defined Isaac's arsenal. Now you can actually craft your weapons from parts you scavenge in the environment or from fallen enemies. Some of these weapons do call back to the original weapons from the first 2 games, but before long you'll realize that creating a machine gun with a grenade launcher is a much better option at taking down wave after wave of necromorphs than the more methodical weapons used in past games. This time around, the necromorphs barely require any strategy to take down because Isaac is so overpowered with the arsenal he's got that strategic dismemberment, the main gimmick that differentiated the entire series, is gone. Sure, you might still need to use strategic dismemberment at the beginning of the game, but once you create more powerful weapons, the need for strategy goes out the window in favor of a more fast-paced gun-ho experience, which isn't really a bad thing. Again, this is an action game. And to add to the fact that the necromorphs charge at you in numbers far greater than the last games. Fights with the necromorphs are less organic because almost every encounter is a battle arena and the game just sends wave after wave of these things rather than having them use vents or use other unpredictable movements in the environment to keep you on your toes. I mean, they still use vents, but it doesn't feel as natural as it used to be. But this time, you have a machine gun that can blow everything to hell if you want to. And I will admit, there is something fun about that. Strategy is gone, but it's replaced with a power fantasy that works because, ironically, the necromorphs serve as good cannon fodder. The necromorphs aren't scary anymore, but they are a hell of a lot of fun to shoot at. The best thing about the new weapon crafting system is that you can now experiment with new types of weapons and find a combination that is right for you. The system isn't in depth as in a PC game, but there is enough choice to make you feel empowered, especially when you make guns that better suit your playstyle. Do you want to create a minigun that spreads hot lead all over the place? Hey, you got it. Or maybe a powerful magnum with a one-shot kill ratio. Yeah, sure, why not? And as mentioned before, there are other parts of Dead Space 3 that capture in some small way the horror that the last 2 games had. Mainly with optional missions that have side stories that are a lot more tragic and screwed up than the main story. Much of these side missions are really just an excuse to search for loot, but the side story of a military organization gone rogue 200 years before your arrival and going through individual stories of this event is very intriguing. The one that stuck with me the most was about a grunt that was mercilessly mocked by hardened mercenaries in the base on Tau Volantis. The mercenaries promised the grunt that they would let him into their ranks if he performed some truly humiliating tasks to earn his keep. After it was made clear to the grunt that he was just being made fun of, he snapped and he beheaded all the mercenaries in the base while they were sleeping as both an act of revenge and as a way to prove to the mercenaries that he does, indeed, deserve to be among them. Ironically, by humiliating the grunt, the mercenaries accidentally created something worse than them, and by the time Isaac arrives 2 centuries later, you get to clean up after the grunt's dirty work. Dead Space 3 needed more stories like these, but at least there is some effort put in telling a compelling side story, even if that story is optional and most people playing might not even bother with it. Another aspect that I really enjoyed in Dead Space 3 is Tau Volantis itself. You have to go through at least 1/3 of the game to get to this point, and Dead Space 3 is a lot longer than the previous games, so if you haven't shut off the game because of disappointment, then you'll be rewarded with a genuinely interesting setting. Tau Volantis is what would happen if the city from John Carpenter's The Thing turned into an entire planet, and the alien lifeform succeeded in spreading across the world. For a planet that is mostly ice and rock, there's a hell of a lot going on, and you even get some genuinely breathtaking vistas that make Tau Volantis feel both familiar and alien. This planet is also where you learn about the military installation that discovered the Necromorphs 200 years before you did, and subsequently killed each other when they realized that the Necromorphs were a threat to all civilization in the galaxy. Here the game does something very interesting. It shows the difference in time. The game takes place well into the 2500s, but by the time Isaac and company reach Tau Volantis, the last civilization to occupy Tau Volantis has been dead for well over 200 years. That might seem like a long time, but from our perspective, both the 2300s and the 2500s feel like a long ways off. So it's very interesting to see Isaac play around with technology that is essentially 2 centuries old. It's easy to believe that generators and buildings over 200 years old are still functional because, to us, they are still built in the future. It poses an interesting question about what the past looks like in the future. What does something old look like 500 years from now? And can we reach a point in the future where technology stops growing because we already exhausted its limits? The guns, the techs, and buildings that were left behind by a rogue military group is 200 years old, but it all works more or less perfectly when Isaac arrives. So, did we reach the climax of technical achievement in the 24th century? Does history really matter when, at least at the technological level, there is no more growth? Maybe, but it's an interesting question that I did not expect Dead Space 3, of all games, to make me think about. One last thing I kinda enjoyed was how you upgrade Isaac during New Game Plus mode. The previous games also had a New Game Plus mode, but in Dead Space 3, once you beat the game, your subsequent playthroughs are focused on making Isaac the most badass and overpowered necromorph killing machine you can create. This, however, does have an unintended consequence if you played the previous 2 games. Playing the first 2 games in your initial playthrough meant that you had to conserve resources. Dead Space as a whole always had more emphasis on the action, but the horror was never overshadowed by the action. This meant that there was still tension in your first playthrough, so you had to conserve ammo and keep an eye on other valuable resources. This also meant that once you went through New Game Plus mode in the first 2 games, it was a reward since your resources would carry over, and now you could play the game with more focus on action since you had more leeway to experiment. The action in New Game Plus mode with the first 2 games felt earned because you played cautiously in your first playthrough, that there was something really satisfying to go through the games again and this time ramble your way through the necromorph herd that gave you so much trouble in the first playthrough. But this feeling of satisfaction does not feel earned in Dead Space 3, and as a consequence the player is robbed of that satisfaction in subsequent playthroughs. It's an action game in the beginning, and that doesn't change much with multiple playthroughs. Is it still fun? Of course. Is it still a Dead Space game? No, absolutely not. Finally, the million-dollar question: how did this happen? How could the Dead Space franchise miss the mark so badly with its third game? While I'm hardly the first one to point this out, it bears repeating that Dead Space 3 is what happens when a publisher gets too involved with projects they clearly know nothing about. Initially, Visceral Games and the creative director of Dead Space 3, Ben Wannant, wanted to focus on Isaac Clarke's psyche, similar to how the Nicole hallucinations were done in Dead Space 2, but focused for an entire game. That sounds like a very interesting idea, and one that lends itself to the darker tones that we see in the previous games, because we know that Isaac has been through some really tough shit that would break any normal human being. But EA, the publishers of Dead Space 3, thought that for whatever reason, a game that focused on Isaac's inner struggles and psychological conflicts would not be marketable for a wider audience. From a business standpoint, I can see where EA is coming from, but if EA actually did some research on the very game they were publishing, they would have figured out that Isaac's psychological struggles were a big part of what made Dead Space's story as a whole so intriguing. When Isaac's guilt and fears manifested in both games, you felt for the guy, and to continue his story in Dead Space 3 would have given loyal fans of the franchise a good reason to come back and see whether their favorite space engineer could overcome the horrors and struggles he would face in the third game. Instead, EA decided that multiplayer needed to be shoehorned in, so Visceral created a co-op mechanic that, while fun, you can most definitely tell that this aspect of the game was not the aspect that Visceral wanted to work on. And you can tell this is the case by the reaction that many fans had towards Dead Space 3 as more focused on action while forgetting what made the previous game so unique. Add to this forced microtransactions, and you can understand why fans who returned to the third game simply did not have the patience or mercy to give Dead Space 3 a pass. But to me, the most tragic part about Dead Space 3 is Visceral Games itself. After the disappointing sales of Dead Space 3, they were put to work on Battlefield Hardlines, which, to put it mildly, turned out to be another disappointment for both Visceral and EA. There looked to be some hope in Visceral's future when they were put to work on a big Star Wars title, but when that project fell through, it was the final nail in Visceral's coffin, and EA shut the company down in 2017. If EA would have let Visceral make the game they wanted to make, it still might not have reached the ridiculous sales goals that EA is notoriously known for, but it most definitely would have sold at least the same amount as the previous two games. Dead Space 3 did have a surprisingly good DLC called The Awakening, but unfortunately, it was too little, too late. I didn't even play it for this review. On the whole, while the almost certain end of the Dead Space franchise, due to the idiotic decisions made in the development of Dead Space 3 is tragic, at the very least, the first two games serve as a reminder of a fantastic franchise that, for a short, glorious moment, was the surprise survival horror franchise in the absence of any real survival horror games. Thank you all very much for watching, and thank you very much for your patience. I may not have a big community when it comes to subscribers, but I do have a community nonetheless, and I thank all of you strangers that actually like to hear me babble about video games. You guys keep me going. I'll see you all real soon.